Good afternoon. I'm Marcia Connolly for the Association of Lifelong Learners. So glad to see a number of you here on this lovely day. We hopefully take advantage of that throughout the afternoon once you leave here as well. We all have lots of gardening to do, I imagine. Today we have Eric and Paul Roorda.
Yipper.
And he's going to be discussing Cuba, America, and the sea. This presentation will be the story of the immigrant boat, Analuisa.
Analuisa.
And the 500-year history between Cuba and America. Eric is the cartoonist for the Alpena News and a creator of the Whitetail family comic strip. He is also the author of 6 books, including The Ocean Reader, Twain At Sea, and Cuba, America, and the Sea. He's been a college professor for 30 years. His specialties are maritime and Caribbean history. He lives in Harrisville. So welcome.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. And thanks to Florence for inviting me to talk to you nice folks today. I'm recently retired. And when I got ready to come here, I put on what I would usually wear for a lecture. And I thought, hell no, I'm retired. I'm going to wear whatever the heck I want. And so, but I am the Boreal Man. That's my alter ego doing the Whitetail family. You might have noticed it on the outdoors page of your Alpena News every Sunday. It's the original's based on my little neighbors in Deer Park down in Harrisville. But I continue to do it, branching out into talking about invasive species and more prominent issues like that. If you're interested in a copy of the coloring book for your grandkids, I've got a few copies along, almost sold out. Everything that's up there today is $10, just so you know. I'll be mainly talking about this book. My academic affiliation that I was fondest of and that lasted the longest was at Mystic Seaport Museum, the largest maritime museum in the world. That press published this book in 2005. Which was based on the journeys that my spouse and our oldest daughter and I took to understand the origins of a vessel that is in the collections of this maritime museum. It is one of 450 vessels in the collection. The best known is the last remaining wooden whale ship, a real Herman Melville, Moby Dick style whale ship, the Charles W. Morgan. But among all of those 450, not a single one in 1994 had brought an immigrant to the shores of the United States. Now, Mystic Seaport Museum calls itself the Museum of America and the Sea. And I think the story of America is largely that of immigrants. I know my people came over on a boat. Unless you're Native American, then you are boat people. Those people are bridge people, right? They came over the land bridge, maybe. Although we know now that maybe some of them came in boats too. So I suggested in 1994, when there was an exodus from Cuba, like there has been periodically, beginning with Camarioca in 1965, most famously the Mariel boat lift in 1979, made infamous by the movie Scarface. But then in 1994, there was another boat lift from Mariel, Cuba, that brought about 25,000 people to these shores and all kinds of different crazy craft, including a 20-foot skiff built in 1959 by an old gentleman whose nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews, a total of 19 people and a dog, got in that 20-foot skiff and headed to the United States of America to find the dream that they couldn't find in Cuba because they were hungry in Cuba, right? And so their 1959 fishing boat conked out in the middle of the Gulf Stream. Now, the Gulf Stream, as I'll talk about in a minute when we get to PowerPoint, yeah, let's go ahead and do that, is 1,000 Mississippis of water that runs through the 90 miles separating the Florida Peninsula from the largest island in the Caribbean, which is Cuba. And so that 1,000 Mississippis of water goes by at the rate of about 4 knots, almost 5 miles per hour. And so when your little boat conks out in the middle of the Gulf Stream, then you could be goners. Let's go ahead and go and advance it here. We'll see what I'm talking about in just a minute here. Just get the basic lay of the land. In any event, the people on this little boat called the Analuisa, named that in 1959 as a fishing boat by Luis Cuadras Hernandez, who had built her, and ironically enough, launched on New Year's Day, 1959, which was the day that Batista fled Cuba and Castro took over. He didn't even know that it was Revolution Day. It just seemed like a good day to launch a boat. So let's go ahead and advance it here. Here we are, 90 miles from Key West to Havana. Mariel is 90 miles. You can see the bay maybe right there. Very good with your cursor. A big industrial bay, fishing bay for a long time. And so the famous one from 1979, the boat lift during Jimmy Carter's era, happened from there. And the one in 1994 happened from there too. So our little friends in the little Analuisa got there, and we can go ahead and advance it for Spain. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last of that vast empire, and they hung on to those as long as they could, because Cuba was really where the gold came from, gold in the form of sugar. So if we go again here to the Gulf Stream. Now, this is a map drawn by Benjamin Franklin, who, through empirical testing on his umpteen transatlantic crossings, figured out it was there. I mean, throwing bottles off and testing temperatures and such, and also talking to mariners, and they all agreed there was something out there. And so he drew this map, which until the early 20th century was still in use by the U.S. Navy. It was so accurate in terms of the dimensions of the Gulf Stream. And so the Gulf Stream separates the United States and Cuba in a much more profound way, those 90 miles, than if it was still water, if it didn't have that incredible impediment. So back to the Analuisa in dire straits, in the middle of the Florida Straits. They thought they were doomed, right? But then, and they had heard from their neighbors that they bring along orange clothing. They could wave that and signal passing ships. Passing ships didn't see their orange clothes. You can't see a little cockle shell from a big ship on the ocean. Those of you who've been on a cruise know that. But then one of the ladies in the boat realized that she had a compact makeup sort of style, compact, in her purse, and suggested they use the mirror. And so they saw a cruise ship on the horizon. It got closer. They're using their orange clothes, and they're also using their mirror, but the mirror did the trick, because the bow watch on the Carnival Ecstasy caught that flash, caught it again, informed the officer of the watch, I think there's something out there. Officer of the watch agreed, summoned the cabin to the captain's cabin, interrupted his repose. You know, it had to be important. And the captain ordered an about face reversal of course to go see what that was. And those 19 people and their puppy were saved by the Carnival Ecstasy. And the ladder they ascended, when I interviewed so many of the people, the whole thrust of the book was this vessel showed up in Key West, totally anonymous, because when the Carnival Ecstasy picked them up, they all had to go up this crazy ladder up the side of the cruise ship. They left the dog, and the captain said, "No, bring the dog." And so the last guy up, who was an Olympic rower, he was in shape. He ascended that ladder with that dog. And as soon as they got on deck, they brought the dog a roast chicken. Now, back in Cuba, you'd save for a month and have a big family dinner where you'd have an actual chicken on the table. Here, the dog was eating the chicken. That night, the whole family went to the buffet. So, they were in Fat City, literally. Unfortunately, that Olympic canoeer, boy, he buoyed up with Big Macs and got adult onset diabetes within about a decade of his arrival, but that's a different story. I kept up with these people, right? So the Carnival Ecstasy went off to Cancun with this extended family and their dog on board, living the high life, hot showers. And then they came to Key West. And as they rounded the corner in Key West, the sharpest eyed among them, the professional fisherman. As a matter of fact, he'd been at the helm the whole time. A guy with the name of Luis Alfaro. That means to the lighthouse in Spanish. Is that not perfect? Couldn't make it up. But Mr. To the Lighthouse, he had his own different story. This is amazing. We have to go back and retract that. But anyway, this dude, he saw on the beach, sitting on the beach, the Analuisa, the vessel that they had left in the middle of the Gulf Stream. How the heck did it get there? Well, after the engine had conked out in their boat, another boat from Mariel that had left the night after, a bigger boat with a bigger engine with 4 guys on it, it conked out too, right? And they within sight of the first boat. And they got the other boat's engine restarted and made it to Key West. So a total of 23 people and a dog, if you count the other 4. And so they all made it to Key West. And the Coast Guard picked up this orphan boat on the beach because those other 4 guys, as soon as they made it to Key West, they booked, right? They hit the beach. And one of the guys had a sister who already lived in Key West. And so they ran to his sister's house and weren't even there when the Coast Guard picked up the boat and took it to the yard where all the boats were coming in during this boat lift. And all kinds of flotsam and jetsam people were getting on to try to make it to America in 1994, just like in 79, just like in 65, just like right now. There's a minor boat lift going on right now. A lot of Cubans trying to get out because things are taking another bad turn for the worse there. But in any event, these guys made it to the U.S. and their boat ended up in the Coast Guard impoundment yard just about the time I suggested to the folks back in Mystic Seaport, maybe we should try to get a boat that had immigrants on board. There's a whole bunch fetching up in Key West right now. And so the guy in charge of collections called the Coast Guard station down there and said, do you have any boats? Do we have any boats? I actually have the notes based, from the archives of the Dana in charge of the shipyard, scrawling down what kind of boats were available. Fiberglass, sailboat, this and that. Old looking wooden fishing boat. Okay, hang on to that one for us. And so instead of being tossed on a bonfire like everything else was, and is still today, if anything gets impounded, Coast Guard, destroys it in the big impoundment yard in Key West. But this one little boat, and there's a photograph of it on its trailer from near the back here. In fact, I should send a copy or two around here while I'm yakking. Here's a picture of the boat in the impoundment yard. This is when the guy in the trailer went down and took a photo before he loaded it up on the trailer. And then when I arrived in Mystic, I got to go and see the rotting oranges, the pieces of clothing, all the flotsam and jetsam of the human migration of a total of 23 people and a dog. So go ahead and circulate so you get an idea of the photographic record. So anyway, this boat showed up anonymously. We had no idea, except it said Mariel in nice bright letters. Turns out they had made sure they repainted those letters with their identification number because the Cuban Coast Guard was making sure that everybody had their papers in order as people were leaving. In any event, we only knew it was from Mariel, Cuba. So I had research I was going to be doing in Cuba anyway, in Havana, partly for a different project. But a lot of the work I did on that project, which was on the grand country clubs and yacht clubs that had a heyday in Cuba in the 1920s and 1930s, all the way up until 1959, until the Castro Revolution, the Havana Yacht Club, the Havana Country Club, the Biltmore Country Club. Yes, those Biltmores, that Vanderbilt family, the Big Five country clubs. So there's lots of pictures of country clubs in here too. And of course, the museums don't have a lot of money. They really support me a little bit to go down and spend a day going to Mariel. Let's go ahead and watch the pictures here real quick. And we'll go through these quick. All right. So Cuba was really important. And after the rest of the Spanish-American Empire became independent, by 1824, Cuba and Puerto Rico stayed colonies. And I was, as you know, Cuba did not gain its independence until 1902 after a big revolution, several revolutions, including the one we call the Spanish-American War. So that's Havana in 1872. This is Havana in the early 20th century. Big bay, strong defenses. That's why it was the most important city in the Caribbean. Onward we go. There it is in 1871, jammed with vessels of sail. This is Havana proper. This is looking north. Okay, let's go make some progress here. Now, of course, the reason that Cuba was so wealthy was sugarcane. Sugarcane grew really well there. There's a phenomenon in Caribbean history called the sugar frontier. Sugar was planted in the smallest little islands in the 1600s by the English and the French, way down Barbados way, and it spread to the bigger islands until the biggest of all had sugar, well, penultimate. The Dominican Republic was the last, the sugar frontier, but Cuba caught the big sugar frontier in the 19th century. In the 1800s, the money just poured out of Cuba in the form of this sweet gold. So now I took this photograph from the car as we left Havana to drive to Mariel the day that I did the research to find out what the heck this Analuisa was all about. That's all sugar cane as far as the eye can see, all the way to the mountain. I'll go ahead and move it along there. It's a postcard from my collection. I think it might be in the book. Many of the pictures in the book are from my collection, the Roorda Doyle archive or collection. And so, of course, not only was it sweet, but it also fueled the rum industry. When America had prohibition, Cuba was, Irving Berlin sang about see you in CUBA. See you where the wine is flowing. Where the sun is shining. So onward we go. Of course, sugar meant the introduction of lots of unwilling laborers, and that's why the slave trade thrived latest of all in Cuba. They were still smuggling escaped, the kidnapped poor people from West Africa into the 1860s. And slavery was not abolished until 1882. And so that meant, as we move along here, that the Afro-Cuban population had much more recent roots in Africa, and they brought their African traditions to Cuba, like in Haiti, in a way that made them more vibrant and more long-lived. Especially, you would call it voodoo, the Cuban voodoo. It's called Santeria. And it has lots in common with the kind of syncretist practices that all of those islands have. African animistic religious practices blended together with whatever the religion was where the island was that they were on. You know, if they were on Jamaica, that became Shouter baptism or Obeah. In Haiti, it became Vodun or Voodoo. In Cuba and the Dominican Republic, it became Santeria. And it's still really vibrant there. And we got to see that as well while we were there. And this was really important to the story as well, because as you'll see on the cover of the book, it features the patron saint of Cuba, Caridad del Cobre. And Caridad del Cobre was a sacred image that appeared to three men from a shipwreck. And they were, in complete desperate straits, ready to founder in the middle of this maelstrom, when the Virgin Mary appeared to them in all her glory and said, "Don't worry, boys, I got this." And the waves fell silent and calm, and they made it back to Nipe Bay. And the next dawn, they found a plank floating in Nipe Bay with a statue of the Virgin Mary. And it's a miraculous image. It's one of those crazy miraculous images like the Shroud of Turin or the Tilde of San Gabriel in Mexico City with this picture of Guadalupe on it. The thing just does not deteriorate. Several popes have come, including John Paul II, made a pilgrimage to see Our Lady of Charity of Cobre, Caridad del Cobre. And so these two big Caridad del Cobres are in the apartment of a curandero and a curandera, a Santeria priest and priestess. Because Caridad is not only the Virgin Mary, she is Oshun, the West African goddess of water. And so whenever, as one of the survivors of the Analuisa said, whenever the Cubans are on the sea, they ask Caridad for help. And she always gives it. And so these people, of course, they're praying like mad out there on this little cockle shell in the Gulf Stream for deliverance from Caridad. And when they made it to the U.S., the first thing they invested in was the biggest Caridad del Cobre you ever seen in their foyer. It's almost life size because they owe so much to her. We went ahead and followed through on a religious procession for San Lazaro, Babalua. Those of you who remember the Lucy and Desi, and Babalua was Ricardo Arnaz's theme song, and that is actually, it's a rumba. It evokes a god named Babalua, and Babalua, his Catholic face is San Lazarus, right? Saint Lazarus, brought back from the dead by Christ. The one you go to if you are, if you got cancer, please, Saint Lazarus. So we went to a procession for San Lazaro, Babalua, at Rincon, which is the shrine of Babalua, just about 20 miles outside of Havana, with our driver, and I'll show you more of our car later on. Here's a San Lazaro, with the dogs licking his wounds. And so there's San Lazaros every place, and there were afflicted people doing promesas. They make a promise, okay, if you'll cure my mom, I will go all the way from the train station to the church on my back without a shirt, dragging a rock with a chain by my foot. And you'll see that in the street, right? Imagine doing that. Imagine crawling on your bare back, hauling a big rock. It's about a mile between the train station and the church. So people were doing these promesas all over the place. You got to get the impression that religion's pretty important there, despite the Castro regime's tries to extinguish it. There's a bunch of Caridads and Lazaros for sale. There's our Caridads. Super sacred figure. Again, the patron of Cuba. We move along, make some progress. Quick aside, the Maine blew up because of bad maintenance. Okay, just so you know, wasn't the Spanish, bad maintenance. Rickover proved it in 1975. The father of the nuclear submarine, he went back and looked at the 1905 records of when they checked out the wreck and decided that Captain Sigsbee had messed up and let a coal fire ignite in the bunker, spontaneous combustion. Didn't check very often. Bad design. The coal bunker was cheek by jowl with the magazine where all the artillery was. And that was just below the forecastle where all the enlisted men slept. That's why 271 enlisted men were blown sky high when the bulkhead between the coal bunker and the magazine superheated. Only took one bullet to go off to send the thing sky high. But of course, that was the reason the U.S. needed to go to war with Spain and end the horrible humanitarian crisis that had unfolded there in the 1890s as Spain tried to hang on to Cuba and starved untold millions of people in the process. So we'll move along. That's the main memorial was built in 1927. Big, fantastic fanfare back when the U.S. and Cuba were good buddies. And that's the main memorial today, or so you can jump and see what it looked like in 1995. They tore the eagle down during a riot soon after Castro came over. The head of the eagle is at the snack bar of the U.S. Not Embassy, right? The U.S. Not Embassy is the U.S. Special Interest Section of the Embassy of Switzerland, because we don't have an embassy. We do have a snack bar, and it's got the eagle head. The rest of the body is in the Museum of the Revolution. And they say whenever the eagle comes back together, that's when Cuban-American relations will be normal again. That's, again, my photograph. So a kind of independence, rushing through some Cuban history here. 1934 is when Cuba got real independence. They took the part of their constitution out that said the U.S. could invade anytime they wanted to. And we did a lot, 1906, 1909, 1919, 1920, 1921, until 1934. Of course, the provision was that we got to hang on to Guantanamo Bay, the real asset for sea power. This photograph appears in my book. I got it from a naval veteran. It's incredibly detailed photograph. I've actually counted more than 41 vessels in this picture. How capacious Guantanamo Bay. Many of them are aircraft carriers. Check it out. So it's a huge asset, still part of the U.S. military outreach across the world. We can see some more of this. Yes, sir.
They didn't realize that the cannon sit out.
That's so cool. That is so cool. I got to follow up on that. Let's go ahead. That's great. I got to follow up on that. I didn't know that either. So there were a couple of big prominent U.S. Companies that dominated Cuban trade. The United Fruit Company, made famous by Carmen Miranda, to keep the banana fleet, painted white to keep the bananas nice and cool in the hall. They figured out air conditioning for the bananas, air-conditioned bananas, air-conditioned cabins. Pretty soon they invented the Caribbean cruise. The United Fruit Company, the Great White Fleet, invented the Caribbean cruise in the 1890s. Read all about it in the book. The Ward Line and the Munson Line both ran regularly. You could go down to the docks in Key West and check your automobile on the Ward Line to Havana like it was an extra piece of baggage, no extra charge, and blast all over that 800-mile-long island. Big competitors. They brought in style the denizens of New York social life during the winter season, which would open up and they'd have a series of races of different kinds based at their yacht clubs. Here's the Havana Yacht Club, very, very wealthy North Americans and the elite Cubans, the ones who supported what was becoming a dictatorial regime under a guy named Fulgencio Batista. And so this is Machado, Gerardo Machado. Batista was the 50s. So I specialized in the Havana Country Club. I got really interested in the Havana Country Club, postcard of it. Again, a lot of my research was based on going to these country clubs and places and see what they looked like. We can move along because this club land that the very wealthy Americans established during the winter season, the same people who would go to Newport in the summer went to Havana in the wintertime, right? About 5,000 Americans living in Havana at the time of the Castro Revolution, which began in 1956. But Castro took aim at those country clubs. And as soon as his revolution took charge, and the country clubs were over, he turned the Havana Country Club into a national music school, as we'll find out. Now, Castro himself, he led a pretty crazy odyssey of a maritime voyage to launch his invasion. He and his partners had been crushed in a previous attempt to uprise against the Batista regime. He'd spent some years in prison, and then Batista made his biggest mistake, which was letting Castro go. And Castro went to Mexico and raised enough money to buy an old yacht, an old pleasure yacht that somebody had named for their grandma. The grandma. And Castro didn't change the name of the grandma. He just jammed it full of 82 guys and tried to start a revolution. Now, Batista's secret police got wind of it. They knew they were coming. All but 12 were killed. But Castro and that dozen, including Che Guevara and his own brother Raul, who took over after he left, went up into the Sierra Maestra. I think I might even. So they were up in the Sierra Maestra for about 3 years, and the peasantry ended up supporting them. And so this is a picture of the 8th of January in 1959, when guys wearing military fatigues and great big old beards, barbudos, the bearded ones, came down and changed everything in Havana. Now, right away, being a man of good taste, Havana, in Castro, when he got to Havana, he established his headquarters at the brand new Havana Hilton. Now, Conrad Hilton had started the luxury hotel industry in the Caribbean by opening the Hilton Caribe in San Juan about 3 years before this. But the Havana Hilton was the grandest of the whole Hilton chain. It had opened just shortly before the revolution, and Castro and Che moved in and renamed the place the Habana Libre, the Free Hilton. These days, it's one of the only places where foreigners can go and use their dollars and go to a gift shop and buy all the stuff that the Cubans can't buy for themselves. So soon after Kennedy came to office, Castro's honeymoon ended. An invasion attempt at the Bay of Pigs scared the Castro regime into trying to get nukes, as you may know. You can the Q slide here of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll just say that in my book, in my research, I found, a lot of the Soviet archives had opened up and a lot of Cubans had been interviewed, and there was so much more to that missile crisis, and we were so much closer to nuclear Armageddon during that period than you understand from watching 10 Days or from watching a book that was published even 20 years ago. Okay, this came out in 2005. But by that time, information about the number of nukes the Cubans had on the island, they didn't just have the launching equipment, they actually had all the way down to two-man tactical nukes that had a 50-mile radius, and they had the green light to use those in case the U.S. had hit the beach. They had bombers that were operational to hit Miami. There's a great story about a submarine chase, essentially, where the captain lost it. He was because he was getting depth charged by U.S. naval forces during the blockade. He was about ready to torpedo a U.S. naval vessel, and it was the KGB official on board that talked him down. So you wouldn't believe the number of close calls. We had an accidental Jupiter missile launch. We had Strategic Air Command wandering into Soviet airspace during these 10 days. There's so many times when somebody could have tapped that button, but it didn't happen. What happened instead was, after the end of the scary blockade, it was great because one of the vessels that was chartered to bring this stuff over was named for John F. Kennedy's older brother, Joseph Kennedy, who was killed in World War II. He had a scale model of Joe Kennedy in the Oval Office before any of this even happened. So we can move along here, and it was the beginning. What they call, it was the fat times for Cuba and for Castro. Between the missile crisis and the fall of the Soviet Empire, 30 years they had it good because the Soviets bought their sugar way above the market price, and they sold the Cubans petroleum way below the market price, so they could run their buses and their society could limp along. In 92. When they had no more sugar daddy, that's when the special period began. And the special period was incredible privation. We were there during the height of the special period. We went there in 1995 and stayed for a month. And there was no gasoline to run the buses. The few buses there were so overcrowded that it was really agony for the Cubans, especially since basic personal hygiene products were so hard to come by, and Cubans are hypersensitive about bodily cleanliness. And so being jammed into these buses full of stinking neighbors was a torture for people who prided themselves in that throughout their history. No newsprint, no sheets for your bed, no pens for your children to draw a picture. Just everything was in short supply. When we went there, we brought suitcases full of the basics for our hosts because they just didn't have them. So we went around then in 1995 and looked at all these places that were so grand before the revolution. That's the Havana Country Club. They got a bust of the revolutionary founder of Cuba, Jose Marti. He's kind of like George Washington. And so, during the Civil War, the North and the South both claimed Washington. Same thing with Cuba. The tried and true Cubans in Miami that always hate Castro and Castroites alike. They all love Jose Marti. So we'll move it along. I thought this was pretty funny. We were going around the place, all right? They turned it into a school for a music school, right? National Music School. But all the students were foreigners because they could pay. They could pay hard currency. And look at the motif on her dress. It's francs and German marks and US dollars. It was all about hard currency in Cuba in 1995 during the special period, because even professionals were making nothing. We talked to a radiologist making $25 a month, right? So people were doing all kinds of work to try to make ends meet. Move along here. They were still using the same Havana Country Club logo, china and stemware in the dining rooms for the foreign students, but they had built dormitories all over the fairways of the Pete Dye designed PGA course that had once actually hosted the PGA tournament back in the grand old days, the 1950s. The yacht club was completely a ruin, although the government was trying to refurbish it to become an Olympic training center. The Commodore Yacht Club had been turned into a private hotel run by the government, not private hotel, but a hotel for foreigners. The Miramar Yacht Club has been turned into a military officers club. And that's the place where we got the best reception. At the Commodore, I took that photograph and the security guys brought me in and I thought they were going to take my camera. But at the Military Officers Club, they invited me in and sold me a poster of Daniel Ortega. But the old bas relief of everything that was offered back in the 50s. Look, fencing, sailing, equestrian events, swimming, crew, baseball, you name it. During the high season in Havana, you could get it at the country clubs. This is behind the Miramar. All of these country clubs had shark pens so people could swim without worrying about becoming the next chapter of Jaws with a bar there. And those are a couple of our friends that helped our research. This is Guido, the driver. His name means I drive in Italian. He had a 1959 canary yellow Ford Zephyr that we hired him to drive us around for all this research, including going out to Mariel that day when I did the research, which I'm circling back around to. Here's our main translator, whose name was Norhe. They named him for a refrigerator, right? This is a society that's starved for appliances when you name your kid after a refrigerator appliance. His brother, Royce, named after the car, Rolls Royce. Country Club Park was a big subdivision next to the Havana Country Club, where the ambassador lived, the American ambassador, and lots of other foreign dignitaries. There's a beautiful Tiffany stained glass window. Somebody chucked a rock through because Country Club Park is sort of the point of animosity today. That is the U.S. ambassador's residence. When we were there, the flight attendants for Swedish Air were actually living in the ambassador's in the ambassador's mansion in Country Club Park. I think I have the other picture. There it is. Actually, no, the not ambassador was living there, but there were Swedish flight attendants as well, renting out part of the structure. We move along and get back to Mariel here. You can see the Havana Hilton in the distance. This is taken from the backyard of where my spouse and my daughter and I stayed in what used to be the Grand section, and now in Havana, now sort of in ruin, because even basic construction supplies have been hard to come by since 1992. We can move along. That's a picture of Che Guevara down by the ferry boat. Oh, this is in there backwards. There's a big poster, a big billboard down across from where the U.S. embassy was in a high-rise apartment building, office building, and this billboard has got a Cuban revolutionary, and Uncle Sam said, "Mr. Imperialist, we have absolutely no fear of you," right across it. This is by the May Memorial as well. So lots of graffiti, no to the blockade. That's the embassy the Soviet Union built in the 1960s. I think that speaks volumes. Look at the size of the church behind it. You can see where the Castro regime's priorities were. Move on along. Let's get to Mariel. You can move onward. Dollar stores, people queued up to try to spend the few dollars that they had in 1995. So that day, then when Guido in the Ford Zephyr got a tank of illegal black market gasoline, that was an adventure in its own right. We drove 90 miles down the coast, this industrial port city, big cement factory, similar to Alpena in that respect, which had been on the down and outs for a long time. And as we can move along, I didn't know much about the vessel, except it came from Mariel. Later on, I did more research, and I found this photograph in the collection of the Mariners Museum down in Newport News, Virginia. It was taken in 1935, and it shows the part of Mariel that was where the fishing families lived. And I want you to take special note of this little boy here with the mopsy blonde hair there. When we got into Mariel and left the industrial section, and we asked, where are the fishing people? La Puntilla, La Puntilla. Turns out that their neighborhood is on a little point called Little Point. So we went out to Little Point, asking around, anybody know about the Analuisa? Anybody know about the Analuisa? So we go down here. We got right down to the end of La Puntilla, and here's all these boats out there that look exactly like the Analuisa. They're all just about the same. 20-foot sailing skiffs or fishing skiffs, auxiliary engines amidships, rigged up with an awning, just like the Analuisa had when it came in. And here's this little blonde mopsy top boy here that I asked, do you know about the Analuisa? Yeah, he heard about the Analuisa. Not real articulate, but he pointed me the way I wanted to go. And next I found a young man who directed me to move along here. You can see all these fishing. None of these are active anymore, right? Because they fished out the waters around Mariel. So all the commercial fishermen have been out of work since the 70s. And all these boats then that were used to come to the U.S. in 1994, or even 79 for that matter, the original boat lift, a lot of them were taken out of people's backyards and rehabbed just for the purpose, just like Analuisa had been. It had been in the builder's backyard getting dried out, and they were worried about leakage. They had to put the engine back in. They broke one of the bolts to mount the engine when they were putting that back in. And the guy in charge of the operation said, 3 bolts, 2 bolts, we're going. And off they went. So I don't have the picture of Luis. Darn, it's in the book. So right after the guy said, okay, go a little farther along, I met the guy who built the boat. And he was in a neighbor's backyard building another boat, just like the first one. Being careful not to use power tools, because that would have tipped off the authorities. What they were doing is they were using hand tools to build another boat. So I came back to the United States with all this information I needed. I interviewed that old man. He told me the story. Well, my people made it. And also Mrs. Alfaro's people made it. And he pointed me to a woman named Caridad, of course. And her son and 3 neighbors had been the 4 folks who were saved by the Analuisa to make the total of 23. So between those 2 old people alone, all the relatives had left. These people were alone. The old man told me the story about, well, the first ones went in 79, and then others went. Now I'm alone. And then I went back to Florida and found them in their various places in Orlando and in Tampa, and interviewed the people who had been on the boat. And so then we had a big exhibit called Voyages, which is the story of immigrants to America. And it was up for about 20 years. And as soon as you walk into the exhibit, which came down about 10 years ago now, there was the Analuisa right there with these silhouettes to try to evoke hard in 2 dimensions what it was like with 19 people and a dog crammed into that 20-foot skiff. There's Luciano Quadras. This is the picture I took of him right after. The young man said, oh, sure, I know Luciano. Luciano's the boat builder. Luciano had built like 5 boats in his life, and he was just helping out a younger neighbor with his skills. He worked in a commercial boatyard in Havana before the economic collapse there, and he'd been allowed to keep his tools when he left, or I should say he kept his tools when he left the Almendares shipyard. And that's how he was able to build so many boats in his life, every single one of which ended up leaving with some of his family members and neighbors. Not all of them made it. One of them blew up trying to refuel halfway, blew up, killed a 5-year-old baby on board. A lot of people perish in the attempt, right? Because you don't know what happens when they're, those ones who aren't plucked up out of the sea by the carnal ecstasy. A lot of them, they just go drifting on that 1,000 Mississippi wide band of water in the ocean at 5 miles. They can't even be within lights of Key West, and it might as well be 1,000,000 miles away because they're going that way, and they're helpless to do it. And then they get delirious. They get so thirsty, they slip over the side. And when the Coast Guard finds their vessel, there's no clue about where it came from or what happened to the people on board. Unlike the Analuisa, where they found this boat on the beach, and I was able to find out that 23 people and a very spoiled dog. I met Cece too. She's on the recordings. Yep, 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 yep. So there's Caridad Alfaro. It's her backyard. Again, from whence her last son departed. And again, here's the quotation from Amaryllis. Caridad, she's the one that's going to save all the Cubans at sea. So I guess I'll bring it to a close there. Looks like I've been yapping at you for a while. Don't want to wear out your attention. I'll also be happy to entertain some questions. Let's see how many other slides here. I got some more thrown in here. Oh yeah, we had a nice little reunion at the seaport. These people actually became the literal poster children for this boat lift, because when they got to Miami, they were separated at the infamous Chrome Detention Center with the dad in one wing and the mom in a different wing with the children, separated until the girl got a fever and they were allowed to reunite in a holding area at Chrome when the Miami Herald photographer and reporter were there. And he captured this beautiful kind of Sacra Familia, sacred family arrangement of the little family of four, that the Miami Herald ended up running it twice in the paper, once in the Sunday Circular in color, and then again later on, kind of decrying the treatment of these people. The little boy, when he went to school, he wrote, this little guy, that's his cousin, this little guy wrote his own perspective on what it was like to get on the little boat and then get up in the big scary boat and then come to America. All this stuff's in the archive. And I'll just go back to this young lady. I interviewed her and she said, I want to go back to Cuba. You can't do nothing here. You can't have no fun here. When you're a teenager, you can't go to the club or nothing. I wish I was back in Cuba. Teenagers. So some of the 23 people, including Mr. To the Lighthouse, and Luciano's niece and nephew, and both these guys were commercial fishermen, and they're skilled. Here's the Olympic canoeist. You can already see he's ballooning on the way to not being fit anymore at all. So that was 6 years later. You can imagine their surprise when I contacted them out of the blue. So I'd like to write about your story. How do you know about us? Well, actually, your boat is at a museum now. What? And so it was a fun project to do. I think that brings it to a close. Yeah. So $10 a shot if you want to read it your own self. Yes, sir.
With the passing the Castros, is really becoming a little more westernized.
Not except during that period, during the previous two administrations ago, when President Obama opened things up and things were getting a lot better. That's I had opportunity to go back there on a still and stuff. We're supposed to go there and we're only allowed to go to San Diego today, which is the south side. We take buses all over the island. I'm staying the whole week in Cuba and in the day. Taking 4 hours, 2 hours. It's 2 hours to bring your money into how much it's and so then we had a trip that was in summer. I mean, in such a way that we got this over family. A lot of students taking a chance to spend with the years. It's back against it. In 1994, the wetbook dry foot policy, which meant that if you got ashore, you stayed ashore. But if the Coast Guard apprehended you when you were close to shore, you went back to Cuba. And that's was some pretty unfortunate scenes. Then they got rid of that entirely. And so now there's not even a dry foot provision. The most interesting thing of that was a guy named Luis Ross and Martinez, which I had some photographs of them, who he fitted out old cars to make them into boats. They called them autonaticos. He was the first one was like 1950s Buick. And he welded these strips up, caulked it up real good. He fitted up the drive shaft under a propeller. And he chugged across the Gulf Stream with his family. And some guy sitting on the roof. And there's a photograph the Coast Guard took from the helicopter. It's so funny. He's got his arm out like they're taking a Sunday drive. But he was apprehended like within sight of Key West. And instead of staying in that thing for a museum, there were protocols to dynamite the vessel and sink it as a navigational hazard. But he was not deterred. He went back and suited up a truck. He did the same thing. This time he did it with a big old, I think it was another old Buick, big old truck. And this time the whole neighborhood would get in that thing. Same scenario, blew it up. But the happy ending is that he ended up getting into the country anyway. And I'd say that that's the kind of immigrant we need, right?
So I have a question. Going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
If you think that the American government knew how serious it was?
No, we,
They didn't, or, you know,
Well,
we know the public didn't know.
yes and no. Yes and no. The U.S. didn't have any idea of the full military capacity Soviets had already established. Cubans were fully aware of it. And suddenly there's all these pale-faced dudes with those Slavic faces wearing checked shirts like there are so many tourists, because that's how the Soviets snuck the men in there. They had 55,000 Red Army troops in Cuba, and the locals were calling it Operation Check Shirt. They didn't know what was going on. They just knew something was going on because there are all these Russians disguised as tourists. So the Cubans knew what was going on, and the CIA knew that, okay, this is going back to Bay of Pigs. The CIA knew that Bay of Pigs had no chance of succeeding on a first attempt. Document shows now. But they assumed that once we got bogged down, well, not us, once the 2,000-man exile army, a lot of those exiles were guys that were former country club members. I interviewed the head waiter of the Havana Country Club. He had left the Havana Country Club with a photo archive when he left on acrimonious terms in the 70s. And so we sat in his garage and went through a stack of photographs of group pictures from the gentleman's lounge, you know. One picture after another, he was the Bay of Pigs. He was the Bay of Pigs. He was the Bay of Pigs. So Bay of Pigs, they knew that was going to fail, but they figured JFK was going to send U.S. forces into the beachhead, keep it from failing. But instead, he balked. Castro captured all 2,000 of those guys and bartered them away for medicine and tractors over the course of the next couple of years. A deal that was negotiated by Milton Eisenhower. I mean, I respect him a lot. Dwight Eisenhower's brother, he was the president of 5 universities, including my alma mater, Johns Hopkins University. But the U.S. Intelligence had no idea about the capacity of the bombers and of the tactical weapons that were already operational now in Cuba. So it's really good that, you know, JFK he went into an understandable bit of rage and almost ordered an airstrike in that way.
Did they have any idea what, you know, did they have any?
Or Eric, you can also just
Did they have
repeat the
any
question as
idea
well.
What would have happened to them if they did something to us in that era?
Yeah, definitely. The question of, you know, if tip for tat, or here we are today, right? As Putin rattles the saber. But remember, this was clandestine, right? It's unlike today, where Putin said, "I'm going to use my nukes unless you back down in Ukraine." Khrushchev tried to keep it as much of a DL as possible. Now, recall this as well, that the U.S. had Jupiter missiles on the border of Turkey and the Soviet Union. And so he wanted those Jupiter missiles off his border. And the only way he was going to get our missiles off his border was put some of his missiles on our border. And it worked perfectly. Kennedy withdrew those Jupiters as part of the unspoken part of the not deal. But it was all understood that was going to happen. So there was a lot more to that deal than Khrushchev blinked. Everybody blinked, and a good thing too, because nobody could have won that battle.
That would have been one of your
1962. Cuban Missile Crisis, October of 62. But you see, Khrushchev was a rational actor, which I don't think Putin is.
Do they have any idea of some of the feelings of the American youth at that time?
Well, you know, a lot of American youth had taken spring break to go fight with Castro.
They may have, but I know of a lot of them that joined the military reserves, so they could be on call in 48 hours, be on a battlefield.
After the missile crisis, remember the missile crisis would extend, you know, well, the Bay of Pigs is what destroyed our relationship with Cuba.
Yeah, but
Castro, there's a great photograph of him hugging Richard Nixon when he came to the UN in 1959. We had him. No, you know, a CIA operation that Eisenhower would never have launched. There's no way in heck that General Eisenhower would have done something so silly as the Philippines. That was just inviting a Cuban Missile.
I just thought about saturation bombing, nuclear or otherwise.
Yeah, no, we could have turned it into a crispy critter, you bet. And you know, I think Wordsmith would have felt a little pain then too. Boy, Wordsmith Air Force Base during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you wouldn't believe the amount of ordnance they sent up there, right? During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, all those bases across the South sent their ordnance as far north as they possibly could. Every inch of tarmac at Wordsmith was covered with, and so you know that Wordsmith would have been right in the crosshairs of any kind of World War II exchange. So yeah, we would have turned Cuba into a crispy critter, but northern Michigan would also have been a place with a lot of burned venison. Good for you. Thanks for your service. Yes.
And on the opposite, well, I got a big voice. Yeah, I see it on. Well, I'm just going to say that during that time, Che and Castro were my heroes. I was a teenager, not interested in Cal Hunter, but I walked a mile for Che Guevara.
And Castro wasn't radical enough for him.
Yes.
Yeah, you see, you know, because he felt that Castro had sold out the Soviets, that he had sullied the pure revolution that we saw, and that's why he went to Bolivia to try to, you know, in his Don Quixote-like way, spark a different kind of brush fire wars, right? That was the Maoist model that Khrushchev had turned away from. Yeah, Che's a crazy figure. I recommend the film version of the Motorcycle Diaries.
I have his biography.
That's great. Yeah, the Motorcycle Diaries is a great book. The film is a really beautiful evocation of Southern America and of that amazing trip. So that was a strong experience.
Thank you.
Not to say that he wasn't a murderer, right? Because he was. He was really hardcore. And after that revolution took over, they did not need to send hundreds of honest public servants to the vault. Alpena. You know, I interviewed one guy that just, his dad was so close to Che that when his dad used his influence to send his son to America to study, as he realized what the revolution was just going off the rails, as a parting gift, Che took his beret off and gave it to the kid, right? And so the kid, his dad, of course, ended up falling foul and going to hell before he could make his way out. But he talked about how his dad was trying to save one police officer who had been denounced by prostitutes, right, for doing his job of picking out hookers. And what was the most notorious red light, right? They estimated 500 brothels in Havana in the 1950s. 500 in the 1950s. It was Sin City. So you'd think that their hookers could go free, but no, it was a good, very lucrative for the police to pick them up if they didn't have the right connections, right? So he got denounced, and you know, this guy's father's trying to save him. No, I'll parade. In that case, it did work. And he ended up, the cop ended up doing like 10 or 15 years and then being allowed to leave. But it wasn't to the wall. And, they were sending people to the wall in that stadium in show trials and mass executions before. That's just wrong. His attempts to validate the sex workers, it's not your fault. To bring to end poverty and to bring about education in the countryside, super admirable. It's just too bad we didn't find a way to work with that charismatic guy right from the get-go instead of turning him into a. Castro's the one who was most willing to have a nuclear exchange. That was revealed by Robert McNamara. Remember the Secretary of Defense for the Vietnam War? He wrote some really revealing books afterwards. But Argument Without End about Vietnam, where he and Late Octo had it out in a big debate in Hanoi. And he went down and he talked to Castro. And Castro was willing to have World War III start. And Khrushchev thought, this guy's nuts. And McNamara said in his book, one of the lessons is you can't always assume that you're dealing with a rational actor. So that's what we got with Putin right now. I'm a little bit worried. So my most recent book was The Ocean Reader. I worked on it for a long time. It came out in 2020. There's a 30% off code here. If you're interested, you can go to Duke University Press, use the code and get 30% off. This lavishly illustrated. And my own pages. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll remind you to buy books because I am unemployed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being such a great audience. Thanks for coming out of the middle of the day.